We are now starting session 2, Liberalism in the Fall of Empire. I'm Tim Luke, I'm cheering. I'm going to start out with Robert Reuschlein, Why Empire Decline from Within. Take it away, Robert.
Okay, empires decline from within. Toynbee would say that 23 out of 25 civilizations he studied have declined because of high military spending. This is sort of my background experience, I'll go briefly over that, just to say that I've already been an engineer, a politician, say the second thing, MBA, CPA, business, academics, books, videos, a variety. I am an interdisciplinarian with a technical start. And 9 interdisciplinary strengths: math, science, wargaming, engineering, accounting, business, public policy, peace economics, and global warming psychology, most recent developments. Conclusions: high military spending ruins the economy, resources go to the periphery and drains the center. Social and moral decay results next. Complacency is a result, not a cause, so I differ with the second speaker on that. And internal nature of empire is like feudalism. Empire society resembles the third world. Look at feudalism. You have the militarism, the castles, the boats. You have the lords and the serfs. Social inequality, extreme social inequality, which is then a result over time in America as well. And you have the last one moves from democracy to autocracy, from equals to lords and serfs. You have Rome starting out as a republic, and then eventually becoming an empire system. You have America starting out as a republic, and after World War II having the imperial presidency. And so you have that kind of move, and the lords and serfs makes sense when you have an economy that has stagnated itself by putting the capital and resources away from normal production and into power projection. You create a lot of stagnancy throughout the system. That stagnancy favors autocracy because top-down works when things are changing. It's sort of a fact. When things are changing and evolving and growing, you need everybody on board, like the Japanese quality circles, looking to the blue collar back in the Cold War days when they were expanding and growing. It needed everybody. They had and that was like America in terms of percent of GNP prior to World War II, 1%. So you have the Yankee ingenuity in the old days, and increasingly we have a more stagnant political system over time as the empire takes hold. So, modeling empire. I use an economic model of two societies: the emerging growth society and the stagnant empire society. Low military spending leads to a rich and prosperous society. High military spending leads to less manufacturing, economic decline, and social decay. And by the way, China today is only 2% of GNP going to the military, about the world average. Most of Europe is about 1.7%. Pushing towards 2 with the banks of Trump. Germany was 1%. So the modern German miracle doing well is at the levels of Japan during the Cold War, 1%, and America for the first century and a half. The 1% of GDP is the key to growth. And why John Maynard Keynes got it backwards in his famous economic equation is partially because, during the interwar period between World War I and World War II in Britain, military spending was only 3% of GNP, not like the 8% during the Cold War of America, triple the level, where it becomes rather obvious what's going on. And during the war, 40% of the military and 40% of deficit you had in 42 and 43 in America, but in 44 you cut that gap to about 7% of GNP, and lo and behold, that's how much the growth rate dropped, from 12 and 13% down to 7%. Then it was dropped again in 44 or 45. It dropped to minus 12% negative, and basically it wiped out that economic growth rate, which in the first couple of years was actually characteristic of the whole recovery period of the 30s. It's much misunderstood that the Great Depression was being relieved steadily during the 30s. There was a 10% growth rate from 34 to 41, except for the one recession year of 38 when the Social Security tax went in and it wasn't compensated for with additional programs to keep the economy growing. So that was the one mistake Roosevelt made. Had he not made that mistake, America would have been out of the Great Depression in 1940 before entering the war. We would have spared the military Keynesianism, the theory that military spending leads to growth. So, I'll move on to the next slide. Oops, this one. I hit the wrong thing. Very good, mess this up now. There, empire and growing. So, the first variable should be power versus achievement. You think of the great human needs, the need for affection, affiliation, love, companionship is one. The other two are the relevant ones here. The need for achievement and the need for power. The need for achievement springs out of the high growth society, the Yankee ingenuity, the research going towards producing things that people can use, control, the power, need for power, also almost synonymous with control, is the militaristic society. And that is the stagnant option, the other one, the growth option. That is sideways. All the vectors start going sideways rather than moving forward. And who is the best for sectors sideways? Lawyers. And who leads the world in lawyers in America? And red tape as well, rather than creative structures like in Europe or something that they have consensus that leads towards dealing with issues like that. The engineer creates. The lawyer merely allocates. I had a lawyer friend of mine who said, I'm just a hired gun. Again, militarism. Service sector. The empire develops a service sector. We're in the knowledge economy and the only service sector. Yes. We have lost our technology edge, we've lost our manufacturing. Look at how well Germany is doing, keeping their manufacturing edge by comparison. And when you lose the manufacturing, the service sector takes over. Witness, Lloyd's of London is the #1 insurer in the world, the British Empire. And up through the 70s, the 8 of the 10 largest banks were either in Paris or London, the old world empires. Then in the 80s, it was 8 of the 10 for Japanese. The Japanese, because they've modernized, do not have the growth that they once had. They've matched American growth, but half of America's growth has been bringing people in from overseas and paying them 2.5 times as much as the average American. 75% of the immigration in America is not the Mexican poor kind, but is actually people who get higher degrees in America or someplace and then come here, or rich businessmen who come here. I can cite case examples that I've lived through my life of people that have exactly fit that pattern. Then win-lose. So the empire, because it's stagnant and crowded, becomes a win-lose environment. the win-win environment, you need everybody on board. If you're going to grow at 9% a year instead of 3% a year, you need all hands on board, all hands on deck. Oh boy, okay, football and baseball. Football is the militaristic sport that took over baseball, and yet Japan, with the 1% of GDP, took over baseball. Drug use and success versus debt, savings, a lot of parallels.
Oh, did people hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, then here, look at the spirit level index. I looked at the 6 most robust in social mobility. If you look at the 22 nations they have in the spirit levels, the advanced nations, the Europe, Japan, Australia, America, that kind of thing. Social mobility was the highest correlation with the empire society, with military spending. With their income inequality thing, it almost matched that. But all these others is much stronger under the military spending than under the income inequality theory of the book, the spirit level that they mentioned. And you can see prisoners much higher, teen births much higher, homicides very much higher, mental illness just a little bit higher, obesity fairly high. You can see that empire is a better theory for explaining these problems. And again, the stagnation of empire at the root of all of this. So the economics. This is graph 997. I won't explain it. Murder, crime, 996. That takes a little explaining too. But basically, modern stages of empire, I've broken it down. I will pass something out so you can go over some of these things. We're down to 3 minutes. The imperial presidency, I mentioned that already, that concept. Mercenary or private. It's interesting that, like, the French economy dropped to 40% of its, dropped to 60% of its level under German occupation. East German economy dropped to 60% under Soviet occupation. And, you know, we currently have an East German running Germany, so they have recovered. Its occupation is the problem. And I'll move on to the next slide. As the service sector takes over, America becomes more like Switzerland with an army. From the 70s to now, we look at the economy going to the financial sector, going up about tenfold. They have dominated. So the service sector has moved in where the technology sector was before, and because the resources going to the periphery, so that's true within the United States. The coastal states and the southern states have gotten the military spending. The Great Lakes industrial basin, where before it was once the richest city in America, has changed fortunes because of the high military spending shift, which is the Cold War represents basically half of the Cold War money spent represents a shift of money from the north to the south. So you get the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt out of that. Industrial triangle, well, they're interlocked with the banks. The military contractors have that last time. Current history, this is very interesting. 1 minute. But it's worth it. If you look at the military budgets, they've been creeping up steadily for a period of time. But if you look at the fiscal year 2008 budget, suddenly there's a big increase. That's from the surge, which was announced in January '07. You get the troops in July, it takes 6 months. And then the fiscal impact was the next year. Those 4 fiscal quarters are exactly the 4 fiscal quarters of the greatest drop in the economic growth rate in America. Exactly that burgeoning military budget in 2008. So it does tie in rather directly. And then, of course, you build in a structure where derivatives have gone up tenfold since the repeal of Glass-Steagall, so the whole structure was fragile. And wrap up that the corruption and militarism of the high military spending states is exactly where the worst abuses in the financial collapse occurred. I'll just scroll through this really quickly and see I haven't missed something really super important. Well, just one thing, the Reporters Without Borders also shows this inverse relationship between military spending and a free press. And that's pretty much it.
Great. Thank you. Okay, next we have Matthew Del Santo.
Thank you very much. I think I'll just start with giving the pressing out for time, but of all the commonplaces of empire, Edward Gibbon's general observations on the fall of the Roman Empire in the West are without doubt among the best known. Published in 1781 as a coda to the third volume of his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, these reflections were Gibbon's own reflections on the narrative that he sketched in the first three volumes. The narrative of the introduction of the veiled introduction of the imperial system under Augustus, to the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West with the deposition of the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476. Gibbon begins his narrative by asking what the Greek contemporaries to Rome's rise thought about the reasons for Rome's rise to glory. And the Greeks, Gibbon writes, after their country had been reduced into a province, imputed the triumphs of Rome not to the merit, but to the fortune of the Republic. The inconstant goddess, who so blindly distributes and resumes her favours, had now consented to resign her wings, to descend from the globe, and fix her firm and immutable throne on the banks of the Tiber. But Gibbon will have none of this. His recourse to the fates, to fortune, is nothing but a vain attempt at mollifying injured pride. To account for why it was that the previously insignificant city of Rome should have arrived at the place of glory it had attained, including over its apparent moral superiors, the Greeks, Gibbon instead endorses the opinions of Polybius, whom he calls a wiser Greek with a philosophic spirit. Polybius has deprived his countrymen of this vain and delusive comfort by opening to their view the deep foundations of the greatness of Rome. The fidelity of the citizens to each other and to the state was confirmed by the habits of education and the prejudices of religion. Honour, as well as virtue, was the principle of the Republic. The ambitious citizens laboured to deserve the solemn glories of a triumph, and the ardour of the Roman youth was kindled into active emulation, as often as they beheld the domestic images of their ancestors. In the 21st century, we might say that Rome rose to greatness because it practiced a politics of virtue. Traditions, both educational and religious, promoted the cultivation of a public spirit that made the polis greater in strength than the sum of its individual citizens. In addition, Gibbon continues, distilling the lessons he had learnt from Polybius, the Romans drew strength from the benefits of a mixed constitution. The temperate struggles of the patricians and plebeians established the firm and equal balance of the constitution, which united the freedom of popular assemblies with the authority and wisdom of the Senate and the executive powers of a regal magistrate. From these institutions, Polybius has deduced the spirit and success of a people incapable of fear and impatient of repose. As his modern editor observes, Gibbon was always wanted to see himself as more than a mere chronicler or an antiquarian. He saw himself as a philosophic historian, and the first among his concerns was civil society. What were the factors that strengthened it, and what were the factors that undermined it? From these considerations, his modern editor continues, flowed the need to investigate political forms, the effects exerted on society by commerce, the nature of virtue as it related to both individuals and to whole societies. Of course, Gibbon has been remembered for his anti-clericalism and hostility towards what he considered historical, if not what he considered true evangelical Christianity. His rise he linked in an ambivalent way to Rome's fall. Thus, in these same general reflections, he notoriously remarked that, as the happiness of a future life is the great object of religion, we may hear without surprise or scandal that the introduction, or at least the abuse of Christianity, had some influence on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. The clergy successfully preached the doctrines of patience and pusillanimity. The active virtues of society were discouraged, and the last remains of military spirit were buried in the cloister. He goes on, painting a decidedly unhappy picture. Yet, Gibbon was prepared to give Christianity the benefit of the doubt. Party spirit, he observed, with reference to the Church's doctrinal wrangling, however pernicious or absurd, is a principle of union as well as dissension. But above all, it was his very admiration for the wonder of civic society, for the polis, the public spiritedness, and the cultivation of virtues, that made him give the new religion the benefit of the doubt. All of these things, the life of the polis were to him a prodigy, almost a miracle. Most human beings, most of the time, had not lived this way. Whenever such a life of civic virtue came into being, the rule of history almost decreed that decline from this point was the rule, not the exception. Christianity's hostility to the cultural virtues of the polis may have accelerated this process, but it would have occurred all the same. Thus, as the reasons for the decline of Rome were obvious, for Gibbon the great question was not why the empire fell, but why it lasted so long. As he put it, the rise of a city which swelled into an empire may deserve, as a singular prodigy, the reflection of a philosophic mind. But the decline of Rome was a natural and inevitable effect of a moderate greatness. Prosperity ripened the principle of decay, and as soon as time or accident had removed the artificial supports, the stupendous fabric yielded to the pressure of its own weight. The story of ruin is simple and obvious. Instead of inquiring why the Roman Empire was destroyed, we should rather be surprised why it had subsisted so long. To put it in other words, Gibbon's question was ours. Why do empires endure? Why in particular did the Roman Empire endure for so long? Gibbon's answer, I would submit, is equally interesting to us at the beginning of the 21st century. To cite Princeton University's Professor Peter Brown, Gibbon believed that Rome's success lay in its ability to persuade the empire's citizens of the continued existence of civic society, even after the reforms of Augustus had in fact transformed it into a monarchy. For a century and a half, its subject cities Rome and its subject cities effectively play-acted the forms and traditions of life in the polis, and derived from that the benefit of the public virtues thereby cultivated, albeit in ever-diminishing quality and extent. Says Brown, what concerned Gibbon was not the size of the empire as such, but its cohesion. The relative weight of its superstructure concerned him less than the extent to which this superstructure threatened to detach itself from the web of social relations whose tenacity and differentiation in the age of Augustus and even that of the Antonines had distinguished the Roman Empire from all other despotisms. The declining Roman Empire is marked by a slow and largely irreversible process of the weakening of the tissue of prejudices and interests, which, in Gibbon's view, had enabled the already unlimited power of Augustus to be exercised decorously, and as a result, was effectively and in a civilized manner. To Brown, the problem, as Gibbon perceived it, was one of a growing leakage of reality. For Gibbon, however, this leakage of reality was not merely an institutional problem. It wasn't merely the fact that Rome had become a monarchy. It was a cultural one too. In an empire, says Brown, reflecting on Gibbon, the spontaneous is attenuated and replaced by artifice. Yet Gibbon was not a man to reject artifice. Part of the conviction that Gibbon's account of the Roman Empire in the age of the Antonine carries derives from his sober sense of the necessity of artifice and its ability and of its viability in an extended society. In other words, precisely because the Roman Empire's rulers continued to cultivate and pay tribute to the spirit and values of the polis, the citizens of the cities it ruled were willing to go on ascribing to it their loyalty. Decline began when, under the influence of prosperity, luxury, and, Gibbon believes, Christianity, the religious and cultural traditions of the Republic were abandoned. With this artifice of culture gone, however, the gap between the rhetoric of the uninterrupted centrality of the polis was made intolerable by the mounting realization that the citizens of Rome, in fact, inhabited an autocracy, and a Christian one at that. Their loyalty, willingly granted before, had been compromised. In a passage that we may consider directly addressed to us, Brown continues by affirming that, in Gibbon's opinion, no large society is doomed merely because it has lost the virtues appropriate to a small community. The classical Roman Empire functioned well enough on an ersatz for public spirit. the decline from artifice to reality was slow and complex, play acting struck Gibbon as a necessary social harm. For some people to wear a mask did no harm. Now, it seems to me at least that part of the relevance to us today at the beginning of the 21st century of Gibbon's general reflections on the fall of Rome is precisely this issue of artifice and reality, more precisely of the increasingly widespread perception of the gap between the artifice of the modern liberal polis, such as we inhabit, and the reality of our experience of power in it. Indeed, it may be, as Pierre Menon has argued, that the system we call representative government turns out to have been the most successful form of play acting yet devised in human history, extending the form of the ancient polis to territorial units far larger than even the Roman Empire. But if Gibbon is right, it is not the geographical or demographic overextension of the modern polis that is its problem, as I think many traditionalist-minded conservatives, particularly in the United States, want to suppose. Rather, as Menon has argued in his World Without Politics, the problem is that the modern liberal empire state, with the modern liberal empire state, is that its form of play acting, representational government, no longer serves to disguise the fact that inland the polis is increasingly moribund. Our parliaments and congresses, town halls and regional assemblies continue to meet, newspapers are published and books are read, but seldom does politics actually seem alive in them. To a large extent, the decisions that affect our lives seem to be taken elsewhere, in boardrooms and committee meetings hidden from the eyes of the people, while the opinions that we spend so much time cultivating appear to account for increasingly little. Now, in an age characterized by sophisticated and thoughtful appeals to return to a politics of virtue, one might have thought that Gibbon's contribution as a historian, and as a philosophic historian at that, might be appreciated, but I'm afraid to say, as a late Roman historian, that if you thought that, you'd be wrong. To sum up the state of prevailing attitudes in the field, I'll quote a few recent statements. Insofar as Gibbon's picture of the Roman Empire is not simply wrong, one historian said, it has been wholly superseded. In the 21st century, one reads Gibbon for his style and as an influential product of late 18th century intellectual culture, but not to find out about the Roman Empire. It is fair to say, says another, that no responsible historian would want to address or acknowledge the fall of Rome as either a fact or a paradigm. The fall of Rome is no longer needed. Another has said, as for the argument from decline, it proceeds from within a historiographical discourse that is itself highly authoritarian. Ogo to be dismissed. This charge of authoritarianism, I think, would have shocked Gibbon, who, certainly in his discussion of Christianity, saw himself as the follower of his contemporary David Hume. To account, therefore, for historians' hostility to Gibbon, I think we need to look elsewhere. Brown himself, Peter Brown, who I quoted before as a commentator on Gibbon, is, in a sense, the late 20th century replacement for Gibbon. He has invented a new model of dealing with the fall of the Roman Empire that is about late antiquity. It's about the transformation of Rome. Rome didn't fall, it was transformed into something else. At best, the political forms of the Roman Empire are graded to have passed away, but that is not considered to have been of any great consequence. The culture of Rome, to a large extent, survived. In succeeding in creating the late antiquity, however, Brown has had to concede something that Gibbon never would have, and that is the inability of the past to speak to the present. Gibbon says Brown was always prepared to see in the Roman Empire a paradigm of the universal dilemma of empires. The historian of the Roman Empire frequently emerges as a sociologist of empire. We must be prepared to meet him and learn from him on that level. Remarkably, however, Brown has been relatively unwilling to do that. Certainly there are good arguments for keeping the past out of the study of the present, but I would submit that the terms on which Brown has forced the two apart have been lavish. The decline and fall of the Roman Empire is not, says Brown, relevant to Western man's image of himself or his society. Gibbon could write as he did because the society of pre-industrial Western Europe was still close enough to that of the Roman world for him to understand it, and to observe that the Europe of his own day had done better with the same materials. We, however, have moved into more dangerous times, to which the Roman Empire and its dilemmas are irrelevant. Now, personally, I think it's quite something for a person to concentrate an entire lifetime to the study of irrelevance. So I wonder how far Brown, as much as I admire him, and I do, believes this. But what of his claim that the dividing line between us and Gibbon, between us and Rome, is the Industrial Revolution? How much credence need we give this? Again, I think we can turn fruitfully to Pierre Manon, who would say that the dividing line is not the Industrial Revolution, but the Enlightenment. With the Enlightenment, the past becomes something itself that modern man must liberate himself from. After all, there is no such thing as human nature, nothing that he can find in the past that he can usefully learn from. There is no longer a constant. Everything is to be invented anew. And that, it has to be said, is just the way most contemporary historians like it. The second is that the past becomes a closed society. It becomes a closed society to be treated with the tools of the anthropologist, not of the philosopher. And this is precisely what Brown has done. He's brought anthropology to bear on the late Roman world. But the consequence of that has been its almost total othering, again in the model of the anthropologist. Yet it was precisely this othering that Gibbon wasn't prepared to make. Indeed, for all of his debt to Hume in matters of religion, Gibbon appears less a man of the Enlightenment than we might think. Brown calls Gibbon, in fact, one of the last late classical men, and I think he's right. To situate Gibbon's decline and fall of the Roman Empire in the terms Alistair MacIntyre has offered us, Gibbon's world was not a world after virtue, it remained thick with it. Because human nature remained constant, the moral laws of the ancient Greek Polis could serve as a constant yardstick by which to judge men's actions through the ages. When he described the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, what Gibbon was describing was the decline and fall of those virtues that had sustained the ancient Polis, and as a result, the Polis itself. And this is where I think Gibbon will be forever at odds with the practitioners of history shaped by the world described by MacIntyre. I'll leave it there. But there are some empires that simply are not allowed to go into decline. And in as much as we live today still in an empire, the modern liberal empire, I'd submit that the modern liberal empire is not allowed to go into decline for much the same reasons that the Roman Empire, in hindsight, is not allowed to have gone into decline. If it later proves to have fallen, my gambit will be that if historians then are anything like the way they are now, they won't attribute that fall, that collapse, to a pre-existing period of cultural decline, but they'll see it in terms of a catastrophe, that the empire was pushed. And I would submit that in as much as the travails of the modern liberal polis are acknowledged at all, we're encouraged now to see them as in catastrophic terms, or as something supervenient from outside. The malevolent desires of outsiders are to blame for our ills, not the moral history of our own republic.
Yeah, the third paper is by Jim Stacey.
And now for something completely different. As I walked through the Vancouver headquarters of one of British Columbia's largest and most powerful trade unions, I encountered glass cabinets encasing Indigenous artifacts. Displayed as they are like museum pieces, their presence simultaneously stands as a symbol of the death of a culture and an attempt to revive and honour that culture. One piece in particular stands out: talking sticks. In Indigenous culture, talking sticks are often passed around a group as multiple people speak in turn. If you don't have a stick, you can't talk. It acts as a symbol of respect. Each individual is given the time they need. And that's more than 15 minutes. Things are very different in the union. One day Trevor, a long-time union organiser of Italian descent, tells me the significance of these sticks for him. In unions, we're used to talking over people, only listening well enough to make a counter-argument. The pace of the conversation is fast. I'll walk into meetings as a white guy with an agenda and say that everyone has 2 minutes to give their piece. You're in and out in 90 minutes. But with Indigenous people, they're much slower and more thoughtful in the way that they talk. They're less interactive and less combative. And the meeting will take as long as it takes for everyone to say what they need to. The talking sticks are there to remind people of a different way of relating to each other. So my contention is that this perhaps seemingly minor reflection in fact has a somewhat revolutionary significance. The 19th century saw European empires conquer almost the entire world, while much of the 20th century saw nationalist liberation from empire. It arguably also saw the entrenching of liberal empires of the mind, with newly independent governments in India, Africa, Australasia, and the Americas reproducing quintessential liberal ideals. Individual liberation from oppressive social structures, secular rationalization of public discourse and political bodies, and neoliberalization of economies. Could the 21st century then see the beginnings of a reversal? Plenty of research over the last decade has demonstrated how liberal ideals jar with vernacular ontologies in post-colonial settings and amongst post-colonial migrants to the West. Yet by focusing on the elsewhere and other, this research may add fuel to the argument that the failure of liberalism to resonate is not a fault in the ideology, but in its recipients, as you were concluding. By way of an alternative, my own research explores where liberalism continues to jar in spaces where it's been entrenched the longest and deepest, global cities in the West. Recently completed research in Vancouver explores liberal ideals in the context of the final frontiers of settler colonialism. This research reveals how citizens in these settings are awakening to post-liberal alternatives that allow them to navigate between liberal ideals and alternative visions of solidarity. In particular, it demonstrates how Indigenous ontologies are helping non-Indigenous citizens to reverse liberal missionary zeal in exploring pathways to alternative social, political, and economic futures. Now, it's become fashionable of late, both in academia and amongst populist politicians, to think of liberalism as a global empire of the mind, circulated and imposed through elite institutions and individuals. The university, the mainstream media, leading politicians, the IMF. This culture is reproduced by a secular, liberal, university-educated, urban elite who dominate and ostracize anyone perceived as stuck in tradition, prone to group mentality, less rational, more religious, and more socialist. In the interest of their economic advantage, these global citizens of nowhere seem willing to sacrifice traditional values and ways of life in the name of progress. And the result is global populist backlash. That's how that argument goes. Certainly, global culture seems increasingly divided along this liberal, anti-liberal fault line. Yet to apply this analysis with broad brushstrokes is to ignore the complex ways in which liberal ideals and institutions spread, mutate, and become actively reconfigured and challenged in different contexts. So rather than treating liberalism as a fixed ideological empire with predictable reactions across the world, they see themselves as dominated by a choice mentality and by a rationalized approach to politics and economics. And they're searching for ways to reconnect with people in more personal ways. With alternatives on the horizon, from Christianity to communism, losing credibility and apparently vanishing in the advance of liberalism, they're uncertain where to turn. In this sense, liberalism can be ethically, if not emically, identified as a dominant cultural force in their lives that limits what they regard as a more natural way of relating to the world and to other people. Yet the people I've been researching are predominantly secular, liberal, university-educated, and urban. So just as their dissatisfaction with liberalism suggests something lacking in the ideology, it also discredits the citizens of nowhere aspersion. These are citizens of somewhere is perhaps best illuminated in the idiosyncrasy of the alternatives they draw on. Vancouver is built on the unceded and stolen territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Rather than a periphery to which it was exported, it's a centre that gave birth to resource-extractive capitalism, which robs Indigenous people of their land and their dignity. It's moreover a playing ground for a global elite, who, inspired by the beauty of the landscape, are buying holiday homes and speculative property, making the city ever less affordable for even the middle classes. Yet this Eden-esque landscape has also brought utopians in droves. Vancouver feels like a place that's always on the cusp of the next social innovation, and I love that. I meet people that often say that, but I read a book recently that said they were saying that in the 1850s as well. So, and so it is that Vancouver is simultaneously a birthplace of resource extractive capitalism and one of its key combatants, Greenpeace. One source of this utopianism is the renewed appreciation of Indigenous culture. Now, the reality is that as an oral culture that was nearly wiped out by colonisers, Indigenous culture is much closer to vanishing than are the European alternatives like Christianity and communism. But specifically because so little is really known about Indigenous culture, it becomes an empty vessel into which all that is felt to be missing from liberal culture can be poured. So I suggest that the content that secular liberals choose to pour into this empty vessel tells us something about what they experience as lacking from the world they inhabit. As an atheist and a homosexual, Trevor is weary of traditional values and groupings. Yet what he senses as lacking is the symbols and practices for what he calls a deeper and more profound way of relating to other people. He feels that individual dignity is being subordinated to a culture of rationalization, which is focused on efficiency. And again, I think that points to what you're saying, that liberalism tells us it's about the dignity of the individual, but that's not what people are experiencing on the ground. The act of talking over other people is an act of instrumentalizing other people for Trevor. So even as the union is challenging economic rationalization at the macro level, it's reproducing it at the heart of organizational practice. The dignity of the individual is supposed to be a cornerstone of liberalism, yet in the case of Trevor, he feels it's subordinated, as I was just saying. As he walks past these talking sticks every day on his way to work, they act as a symbolic reminder for Trevor of a different way of relating to people. And he hopes that by working at more personal relationships from the bottom, he can slowly work his way up to changing the culture at the top. Now, talking sticks are clearly just one star in a constellation containing books, films, life experiences, even religion at times, that make up Trevor's ethical imaginary. But what's important to note is the continuing function of symbols, objects, images, and metaphors in filling the secular ethical imaginary with content. And that in a world with ever less alternatives to draw on, small symbols like this are vital. It's equally worth noting that Trevor's not necessarily representative of Vancouverites as a whole, many of whom either ignore or revile Indigenous culture. But the recognition of personal responsibility for colonisation and the desire for reconciliation is widespread in activist circles. So too is the not unproblematic valorisation of Indigenous people as the noble savage who stands at the final frontier against global capital. There was a time where a particular piece of land was actually given back to one Indigenous tribe, and the chief chose to develop a shopping mall on it. And there was this outroar from the liberal left who treat them as this, last man or final frontier. And I don't know what they expected them to do with the land, but it's very interesting. The survival of a pre-liberal culture is helping Trevor and many others like him to adopt post-liberal approaches to the world. One way we might think of this is as an act of reverse colonisation. This small symbol is helping Trevor to undo the liberal empires enveloping his own mind. Now, am I suggesting that the seeds of a global revolution, a new empire of the mind, are now being sown in Vancouver? Are we all going to be passing talking sticks in meetings in the near future? Certainly not. But what I would suggest is first that the way liberals choose to relate to Indigenous culture points to something that is missing from their own. And alongside this kind of more real or profound respect for the dignity of the individual, I also observe the revalorization of animals and objects to a status of equality with humans. And second, the resources for filling this gap may be closer to home than we think, namely in the languages, stories, and symbols of the very people being lost as liberal ideals advance. And yesterday we got talking about how there used to be much more variety in dialects around Europe, and I haven't looked into this properly, but it really interests me to think, is it possible that reviving old dialects in various places could also revive cultures of resistance? I don't know. What this might mean in a place like Europe, where many such alternatives are already extinct and forgotten, is unclear. But the case of Europe reminds us we need to act fast. Resistance is easier than archaeology.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes for questions. Andrew.
Thank you. Just to say thank you for the whole panel. Tim, the paper was amazing, and the note on which you ended was so evocative for me. I mean, I live 30 miles from Vancouver in Victoria, so you evoke the place where I live in a very powerful way. And what I wanted to ask you is sort of twofold. Let me see if I can frame it briefly. So this, the kind of liberal appropriation, romanticizing and commodification of indigenous culture in order to legitimize liberalism is sort of an everyday fact in Canadian public life. One thinks of Justin Trudeau, the Mind. I think I was sharing with you yesterday. I note with interest how when I'm in Europe, Justin Trudeau is viewed as a kind of messianic figure, quote unquote. Very much not how he's viewed in the public debates in Canada.
Yeah.
With the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And so if I'm correct in understanding your analysis of the liberal appropriation of Indigenous culture, what does that say about Canadian public life? And are there applications to other analogous circumstances where liberal politics is seeking to appropriate Indigenous culture? The other aspect, I'll be super brief, I found myself thinking of the fact that Vancouver, as the headquarters of the Lululemon company, is also a headquarters of the Western romanticizing and commodification of a, quote, Eastern aspect of culture like yoga culture.
Yeah.
And so does your analysis extend to the colonizing and appropriation of cultures that are not Indigenous to Canada? Like, for instance, yoga culture. Just your thoughts on any of that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the last bit, that's something I was really interested in. So who I actually spent most of my time with was a community organisation that basically tries to politicise ordinary citizens and get them more involved in bringing about social change of various kinds. So I was really hoping, although you can't, you're not supposed to influence your research participants, I was really hoping at some point they would try to organise a yoga studio, because they are so prominent there. But I think I don't know if this is correct. I'd really like to see an example of kind of politicised yoga in the West. But I think the assumption there is that it's kind of about this wishy-washy individualism rather than about, it's actually reproducing a particular kind of liberalism rather than challenging it. So the people there weren't really trying to do that, but as I say, I really hope they would.
I think the thing that you were saying before is really interesting, and I'm not sure I can actually answer it now. I'm thinking about how certain liberal politicians, they're not necessarily appropriating Indigenous culture, they're using gestures towards Indigenous people as a way of distracting from other more neoliberal social reforms. So I can't work out the connection, but it's very
Thank you so much.
David and Paul and Wayne. Okay. That's to keep us going till the rest of the day.
So, I have a question about the decline of the Roman and in the way in which Gibbon is attributing it to, I guess the argument was that there was this civic culture, right, that had disappeared, but there was still a kind of sense that it was still existing.
Or the actual political form, the actual reality of power was now a monarchy, right. but the culture and traditions of civic life continued in a sense disguised that fact.
Right. Yeah, but so people had a sense that you still get that, and that was what led to the stability, right? And I guess, I guess, it contrasts with the way I had always conceived it, which was the opposite, which was to say that it was actually the forms of monarchy and the way in which those form as kind of representation of of political power was really what maintained the stability, because that's what allows different peoples within the empire to have a kind of common sort of representational reference, and therefore allow for a kind of stability with difference, as opposed to a kind of civic culture model, which would be okay for a republic, but once you have an empire and you really need to integrate all these different cultures, that model would break down.
I think the difference is that Rome was an empire, but conceived itself as a republic. And what somebody like Brown is saying is that up until at least the 4th century, most people still imagine themselves as living, that is, most people lived in cities. I'm not talking about the 90% of people who lived in the countryside, but the tiny number of people who lived in the cities of the Roman world conceived of themselves as still living in city-states, city republics. And it was the city councils of these states that both preserved the civic culture and collected taxes on behalf of Rome and returned those taxes to Rome. But Rome again, because Rome embodied the same culture, what they had in common with Rome was a culture, and a cultural, a republican culture, as it were. So it wasn't the awesome power of the emperor that inspired people's loyalty. People are saying up and given the saying, what Brad is saying up until the 4th century. It's a consensual identification of culture, of interest based on shared culture.
I would see it differently. I would see the military aspect as Brian. If you tell your succeeding emperor, always pay the military well, keep their loyalty to you, you have a spiral upward. And at 500 AD, the Janissaries of the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople were paid 16 times as much as a soldier in Britain at the same time. So there was this vast spiral upward that led to the centralization of power of the empire, of the emperor taking over from the republic of the Senate.
Most different traditions there might have been, but what's crucial to remember is that up until at least the middle of the 6th century in the Eastern Empire, the imperial army, force wasn't imposed by the imperial army. Force was extracted centrally from cities. The imperial army was on the frontier, hundreds of miles away from cities like Antioch. They could only be governed by the consent of the people.
The consent of the people is very much like the modern U.S. situation, where now Princeton and Jimmy Carter both have shown that it's an oligarchy and not a democracy anymore running America. And yet the people believe it's a democracy. So it's very much like you're describing there, that there's a reality on one side and there's a perception and a local running, like the cities you're talking about and so forth. There can be two contradictory things going on at the same time.
Well,
I very much enjoyed all 3 papers. I've got just a brief intervention on all of them. Robert, your paper is something I once studied in detail at the military economics, and I just thought it'd be useful for your presentation, maybe for you to emphasize, which perhaps you hadn't had time to do, when you mentioned the decline of manufacturing. With militarism may seem counterintuitive to some people because obviously there's a whole military. MIT is all about producing engineers for the military, but there's some research by a Columbia economist whose name escapes me showing that that's part of, that is sort of the nub of the problem, is because all of the top engineering talent is producing high-tech stuff that has no relevance to the real economy. It's only relevant to the military economy. So that's why Germany and Japan and now China are able to produce good, cheap, competitive consumer goods, whereas America lost that ability. It was having the wrong kind of engineering.
Melman.
Yeah, there you go. And Adrian, excuse me, Matthew, I couldn't help thinking of something Morris Berman, the sort of cultural decline author and sociologist, was interviewed recently and quoted Paul Krugman, the famous liberal journalist, who said that it's anyone who talks about the relevance of the Roman Empire is foolish. And then Berman said this is the fact that he says that shows how stupid America has become. That in fact that America is in steep decline, and improvement is a good evidence of it because of the decline in education and sort of that public intelligence generally. But what my question for you is about this idea about play acting. Is this similar to something that Alistair McIntyre talks about? I think it's in After Virtue that there's certain afterlife of virtue in the Anglo-American West or Europe, even after the belief structures that undergird it have basically disappeared, but there's still sort of a play acting of reading the Republic and stuff like that in elite colleges, which creates, for a while, an elite that is capable still of ruling until that falls apart.
That's certainly the argument that Patrick Meehan makes.
Okay. And then just finally, Tim, I enjoyed your talk as well. I just very quickly, when you mentioned at the end about looking at animals and things as being something that might be a borrowing from indigenous cultures, do you think that's interesting from the perspective of looking at them in a symbolic order, or more as being philosophical, anthropological equals of humans, or what? I mean, is it the symbolism of it that you think is useful, or do you think that is in fact useful contribution to Western thought patterns? What is the role of symbolism in that looking at animals and objects?
So the main one that comes up is the orca. That's the most probably, well, other than salmon, it's the most sacred animal in that area at the moment, at least as I understand. And it's got two channels. So one is that it's creative in the sense of, I remember one person talking to me about how she'd become inspired by Indigenous people to be passionate about orcas, and then she started looking into it scientifically and understood that they had hyporchal biology, so like a particularly large frontal cortex or something, which is the thing that determines your sense of self. And so they actually identify the self with the pod. And so, you've got a strong sense of community there. And so this is what really inspires her in particular. So one thing is the social idea, and that's strong in Indigenous culture as well, like valorizing the salmon because they will get back up the river together and things like that. But the other track is in the sense that they think it becomes a way when you have nothing left, no resources left resisting resource extractive capitalism, no ideological argument, no rational argument. If you render something, the land, the animal, sacred, then you get to say, well, you can't do that because you'll kill the orchid. Instead of, you can't do that because it's not good for growth, or whatever the argument might be. Or sustainability, I suppose.
First point, talk about the research. When you look at the research, in 1980, Germany, Japan, the United States all devoted 2.6% of GNP to research. The difference was 1/10 of a percent of GNP was military research in Germany. 0.7% of a percent of GNP was to military research in America. So you're right, Joe Biden mentioned it in 1987, that the 90% of the scientists from Caltech and MIT go into the military. So that co-opted things. I didn't know that when I took my electrical engineering degree from the University of Wisconsin, which must have been right behind those other big two, because it was third ranked in the country at the time. I didn't realize until after I graduated 4 years later in '72 that I was at the peak of the Vietnam military budget in '68, and it was diminished considerably by 1972, and 50% of electrical engineers worked in the military contract. So basically, I got into accounting instead. But that's another story. And if you look at one expert has estimated that 33% of military research has a dual benefit, a civilian benefit. And I see that fitting in the model of 1/3 too military specific to be a benefit, 1/3 too much secrecy. You can't have conferences like this and talk things out and learn things in the military-industrial complex that same way. Too much secrecy, and then 1/3 dual benefit. But and then if you realize that that seems to be the only point of justification of the military, you look at 90% is not research in the military budget. So if 2/3 of it is lost, then you're down to 97% waste in the military. And if you look at I also did work in venture capital at one point in time. If you come up with an idea and you're lucky to get 20% of the market, you're lucky. And 80% go to competitors eventually. So actually of that 33%, it's only 7%. So it's actually 99.3% waste. So it's for the 100 I use in my models work so well that I've got a 60-year model of the U.S. economy with correlation 0.39s to add in a convertive wave and a juggler wave and a deficit carrying you through World War II and things like that. So I am basically a 5-factor model with 2 extra collapse factors for Great Depression and oil prices. And other than that, that makes 5 factors all in all. It runs like Swiss watch. So I think that tends to prove that the military spending has an essentially near 100% economic loss is a good place to start.
Wayne.
It's late, so I'll be trying to be fairly quick. For Matthew, I think the philosophical history stuff is extremely useful. I agree with you about that. But it does need to be de-centralized and universalized using more contemporary organizational principles. We can't just do Gibbon. But I think you're right about the importance of that. But it's important not to exaggerate his view of Christianity. The recent scholarship on Gibbon and Hume is not very sound because they're written by younger people who assume that if you say how horrible Christianity is, you're not Christian. There is evidence that Hume was certainly anti-Christian and certainly not theistic, but his view of religion, as Milbank is right about this, is so pessimistic that you can't get rid of this junk, according to Hume. And Gibbon is different. Gibbon has a lately secret Christianity. He's a Laodicean Christian underneath it all, in a very cynical Roman kind of way, but he's not anti-Christian in the way the younger people think. The other point, I think, was I don't think anyone in this comment says enough about law. And the argument about whether Rome declines or survives has to be thought of deeply in terms of law, and the evidence there is quite interesting. The New Oxford History of the Middle Ages, of course, gets rid of the term Middle Ages because there weren't any middle, and shows that Rome didn't die. It shows that Rome does not decline. This is a fantasy of people who look at state forms and not at law. And if you think of church canon law, you see it's deadly true, because marriage is being regulated throughout the world now by Rome. And we have the Pontifex Maximus in Rome now. And as Francis is finding, the old Roman model is more alive than we'd like it to be.
Law is one thing, but you have to talk about the law of apply. And I would challenge anybody to consider the blood-feuded Merovingian law a demonstration of the survival of.
I agree with that, but if you take the Roman East, which you know more about than I do, then McGuicken, I think, is the key text. If you read McGuicken's book on how the Roman law was transformed in the Greek East on Orthodox principles, you see that, yes, there's enormous bloodshed, and yes, it's not applied in the way you might hope, but it does change the Byzantine world to a degree that people in the West are insensitive. McGuicken's the leading historian in the Orthodox world of this. Read the book.
Oh, well, I will, but I mean, I don't think that you can say that just because Justinian codified Roman law and produced a new codex, the conception of power that was contained in that codex showed no signs of change between the earlier empire and the later empire.
McGuicken's arguing an Orthodox case. His point is not that pagan ideas continued in the Greek East. His point is that Orthodoxy made the excellence of Rome live in a new form. And there is some truth in that. It's coming from Orthodox theology. He's the leading Orthodox thinker.
I'd like to jump in a little bit on culture. Culture versus, this fierceness of militarization of the society or not. Japan is often a very peaceful culture. Buddhism is a very peaceful thing. And yet you see the rampant militarism of the 30s. Well, okay, 7% of GNP is very, very high. No state of militarization there, and there was no state in the first 50 years of the 20th century. You didn't see the fantastic growth after World War II when they cut military spending, and it changed the whole nature of the society. But you don't see also in the German personality. Many people looking at the German personality think, well, these aren't a bunch of mean, vicious Nazi Huns or something like that. What's going on here? Well, you look at the late 19th century when the Prussians had the best schools in Europe. They had low military spending. That's what allowed them to become the great power they were in the two world wars. And then the militarization takes over and changes the nature of the person. So it's the structure is often dominant over the culture or the religion, if you will, the individual. Because of that, I kind of learned that lesson getting my MBA too. That there's one school of thought that structures are dominant, the other that human behavior is dominant. And I had two secretaries that were totally different. One was very outgoing, one was very reclusive, and the exact same problems occurred with both secretaries. So it was the situation and the structure that was actually dominant.
Of course, I agree with that, but we have to get the history right. In Japan, Buddhism was not peaceful. The monasteries and the orders were engaged in violent war, and the leading Japanese peace movement, which is Soka Gakkai, 1/3 of the political system, is a form of militaristic pacifism. So these dualisms are not useful, and you can have whatever stats you like, but the dualisms have to be checked against real history.
Well, I agree. You say that the Japanese soldiers, the few of them that were in Afghanistan or Iraq, I don't remember which one, are some of the most vicious fighters there. So there's always these contradictions, and I'm just looking for tendencies among the multitude of contradictions.
Okay, it's 11:59, so why don't we continue our discussions and debate over lunch so we can stay on track for our afternoon activities. And let me give a hand to the